The morning Samuel Whittaker's life changed forever was the kind of morning no one remembers, a gray Tuesday, neither warm nor cold, quiet enough to feel safe. The kind of day people pass through like fog, unaware they're stepping over the threshold of everything that once felt familiar. He had kissed his wife of 4 years on the forehead, murmured something about dinner, and driven toward the hospital for his shift as an ER physician. There was coffee in a travel mug, music on the radio. There was no sign, no chill, no omen, just motion, just habit, just life. Until the intersection. Until the red light. Until the truck that didn't stop. The collision shattered metal and glass, but more than that, it shattered time. 1 second, Samuel was adjusting the volume. The next, he was suspended in silence, his body crumpled like the steel cage around him. Emergency services would later call it a miracle he survived the initial impact, but for Samuel, surviving wasn't something he remembered doing. He only knew darkness and then silence and then more silence after that. When he was brought to the ICU, the attending neurologist didn't offer much hope. Traumatic brain injury, comatose state, respiratory aid, they spoke in terms that weighed heavy in the air like clouds ready to burst. His wife Caroline visited every day for 2 weeks. She brought books he liked. She read him parts of them, unsure if her voice crossed the distance. She kissed his forehead the way he had kissed hers that morning, but softer, trembling. She talked to the doctors, learned the language of injury, clung to statistics like driftwood. And then she stopped coming. It wasn't abrupt, it was a quiet withdrawal, a few missed days, a nurse's note about a phone call not returned, then a lawyer visited instead. In room 403, where the machines hummed and the windows watched seasons turn, a new rhythm began. One nurse, a few years into her career, began covering the ICU night shifts. Her name was Eliza Morno. She had soft, brown eyes that seemed always on the edge of a question and hair she kept tied back with an elastic band that had once held a patient's get-well balloon. She was steady, competent, and quiet. No theatrics, just presence, just care. Eliza didn't start talking to Samuel right away. The first week she tended to his charts, monitored vitals, turned him gently to prevent bedsores, the usual protocol. But over time, she found herself lingering a little longer during her rounds. Her hand would rest on his for a moment. She would smooth the crease in the sheet near his shoulder. Once, when the power flickered during a summer storm, she whispered to him that it would pass, even though he wasn't awake to hear it. But maybe he was. On the 16th night she was assigned to him, she brought in a small Bluetooth speaker and played Debussy. She wasn't sure why. It just felt like the kind of music he would have liked. She couldn't explain it. Then she started talking. Not about medicine, not about vitals or swelling or prognosis. She talked about her mother's empanadas, about her neighbor's cat that always tried to sneak into her apartment, about the way the sky looked at 4 in the morning from the west stairwell. "I don't know if anyone told you," she said once, her voice barely a whisper over the soft rustle of machines, "but you're still here, I see it, even if no one else is sure." And still he did not wake. Weeks bled into months, the hospital changed around them. New interns came through, holidays passed, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the quiet lull of January. Each shift Eliza returned, and each night she held his hand. It wasn't part of her training, no one told her to do it, but it was how she remembered people were still human, even when they looked like they were. One morning, just after dawn, while she was adjusting his IV, she noticed his fingers twitch. She froze, waited, looked at the monitor. A spike. Another twitch. By the time the day shift nurse arrived, Samuel was opening his eyes. They were clouded and confused, his gaze didn't settle on anything, but they were open. He was there. He was back. News spread quickly. The neurologist reviewed his scans with a disbelieving shake of his head. Samuel's brain activity was higher than expected. There was no clear explanation, but no one argued. They just watched as slowly, over weeks of therapy and uncertainty, he began to return to himself. He didn't speak at first, he couldn't. Words were trapped beneath layers of fog, his muscles atrophied, his mind frayed at the edges, but Eliza remained. Even when her rotation changed, she requested to stay in the ICU. She told herself it was just to see it through, just to help him transition. But it was more than that. It was the way he started to look at her like he recognized something, though he didn't know what. It was the way her name was the first one he managed to say, hoarse and halting, but full of intention. Eliza. Not his wife's name. Not his mother. Hers. And when he said it, something unspoken passed between them, something shaped like hope but not yet called love. It was too soon for that, too early for anything. But it was a beginning. And beginnings are never small. Not when they come after the end. Samuel remembered waking up like surfacing from beneath a lake, his limbs heavy, breath unfamiliar. The world was too bright, too sharp, everything echoed inside his head. But there was one moment of clarity, her hand, warm and still around his, and the way she said his name like she'd been waiting a long time to speak it aloud. He couldn't recall much else. Time blurred. His memories felt patchy like water-damaged pages. He didn't know how long he'd been unconscious. He didn't know why the ring on his finger was gone, or why there were no flowers, no photos, no visitors except the quiet nurse with the kind eyes. Rehabilitation was slow and undignified. There were days he couldn't bear the sound of his own voice, slurred and thick, or the way his hands trembled when he tried to hold a fork. But Eliza kept showing up. Even after he was moved to a recovery ward and her assignment technically ended, she found reasons to stop by. She brought him books, not the ones his wife had once read to him, but new ones, short stories, novels with soft titles, stories where people made it home in the end. He couldn't read more than a few pages at a time, but she never rushed him. Sometimes she read to him, her voice quiet, deliberate, the way sunlight feels through a curtain in late afternoon. One day he asked her haltingly, why? She looked up from the book in her lap. Why are you still here? He asked. Why me? Her answer took time. She didn't like answering questions she hadn't thought through. Because you didn't let go, she said finally, and I didn't want you to be alone if you ever came back. Something shifted then. A weight he hadn't known he carried moved just slightly. Not gone, but different. Samuel's wife came once, several weeks into his rehabilitation. She stood in the doorway like a stranger, her coat still on, her hands folded in front of her like she wasn't sure if she should touch anything. I thought you wouldn't wake up, she said after a long silence. I did, he said, eventually. They didn't argue, they didn't cry. What happened between them had already unraveled long before the accident. His coma had only paused the unraveling, but it hadn't mended anything. Her life had moved forward. She was kind but distant. She left without asking if he wanted her to return. Afterward, he didn't mention her again. Eliza never asked about it. There were better things to fill the silence. He began physical therapy with renewed determination. He wanted to walk again without the railings. He wanted to eat without dropping the spoon. He wanted his body back. He wanted something to be whole. And Eliza was there. Sometimes she sat in the corner during sessions, charting quietly. Other times she walked beside him in the hallway, not offering help unless he asked, but always present. She was a gentle shadow, a silent witness to each small victory. They shared coffee in the hospital courtyard once, months after his first steps. It was late spring, the kind of day when everything smells like blooming soil and cut grass. I didn't think I'd care about coffee again, he said, cupping the paper cup between his hands. But here we are. She smiled over her own cup. Small things matter more after loss. That's what my grandmother used to say. He looked at her. What did you lose? Eliza didn't answer right away. My father, when I was 19, he had a stroke. We didn't catch it fast enough. I was the one who found him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It carried a kind of mutual reverence. I'm sorry, he said. She shrugged, but not with dismissal. It's part of why I became a nurse. I kept thinking if someone had been there, if someone had known what to look for, I don't know, maybe it was a way to make sense of it. He nodded slowly. I think I was trying to make sense of things too. Before the accident, my work, it filled everything, even the quiet. You think you'll go back to it? She asked. I don't know who I am in it anymore, he admitted. Their eyes met. Later, when he was cleared for discharge, it felt like something was ending. They didn't talk about it, but the goodbye hovered in the air like stormlight. I guess this is where you move on to the next patient, he said, trying to smile. Eliza shook her head. This isn't that kind of story. He looked at her uncertain. What kind is it? She hesitated, then reached out and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand, the kind that doesn't end in a hospital hallway. It was her number. Her handwriting was small, careful. I don't expect anything, she said, but I'd like to keep knowing you outside of all this. And then she was gone, off to another wing, another shift, another life. Samuel stood in the hallway a long time, the note held tight between his fingers. That night, alone in his apartment, he unpacked slowly. He didn't recognize half the clothes in his closet. There were boxes with dust and bills he hadn't paid, but on the table beside his bed, he placed the note. He read it once more before turning out the light. And he slept without machines for the first time in nearly a year. Samuel didn't call her for 2 weeks. It wasn't avoidance, it was caution, something new to him. Before the accident, he'd moved through life with a kind of quiet assurance, efficient, decisive, always knowing the next step. But that version of himself felt like someone he had once met at a party and never really got to know. Now he lived slower, more carefully, aware that everything could change in a heartbeat. He kept Eliza's note in his wallet. He unfolded it once a day, not to read it. He'd already memorized every loop and slant of her handwriting, but just to feel it between his fingers. To remind himself it wasn't a dream, that someone had been there when he was nowhere at all. When he finally called, it was late afternoon. He almost hung up before it rang through. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, the kind of warm that didn't need to try. "I was wondering when you'd decide," she said, not unkindly. "I didn't want to make a mess of things," he replied. "You won't. I might. Then we'll clean it up." They met at a small bakery near the river, a quiet place with fogged windows and worn wooden tables. Samuel was surprised by how nervous he felt. He'd seen her nearly every day for months, but that had been a world defined by sterility and structure. Here, in real clothes and real light, she seemed both familiar and foreign. She smiled as he approached. "You clean up nice." He laughed softly. "I had help from a mirror and about 17 attempts at choosing the right shirt." Over pastries and tea, they talked like people learning a language together. She told him about her brother in Portland, the houseplants she kept killing despite her best efforts, the night shift stories she could never tell in polite company. He listened like someone learning the shape of her voice from scratch. He told her about his recovery, the milestones, the frustrations, the long nights where he felt like a ghost in his own life. But he left out the details of his marriage, the way it had hollowed out long before the accident. He wasn't ready to give that grief a voice just yet. What surprised him most was how easily he laughed, real laughter, not the polite kind. It felt like finding an old song buried in a drawer. They kept meeting after that, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks by the water where she told him stories about her childhood in San Antonio and he recounted his years in medical school, how he used to sleep in stairwells between shifts. One evening, they wandered into a quiet bookstore. Samuel ran his fingers along the spines like he was greeting old friends. "Pick one," she said. "For you. For us, something we'll both read." He chose a novel he hadn't read since college. It was about two people who met in passing and didn't realize they'd changed each other's lives until much later. He liked the way the story didn't try too hard. Eliza smiled as she read the back cover. "You're a romantic," she said. "Don't tell anyone, I have a reputation to maintain." Their routine settled into something gentle and unspoken. They weren't a couple, not yet. There was no title, no timeline, just shared moments, simple, steady, and without expectation. But even quiet things grow roots. One night during a slow rain, Samuel walked her home. She lived in a narrow apartment above a florist's shop, and the scent of lilies lingered in the stairwell. She hesitated at the door, keys in hand. "I don't want to assume," he said, voice low. "I'm not asking you to," she replied. They stood there a moment longer, not quite touching. Then, as naturally as breath, she reached for his hand, not to pull him closer, not to invite anything more, just to hold it. "I used to think the hardest part of nursing was watching people die," she said softly. "But it's not. It's watching them come back and not knowing if they'll stay." He closed his fingers around hers. "I'm still here." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "You say that like it's a small thing." "It's not," he said. "You're the reason I am." In the weeks that followed, he began volunteering at the hospital, not in the ER, not yet. That would take time. He wasn't sure he'd ever return to medicine in the same way. But he found purpose in the quiet work, helping new patients adjust, telling them they weren't alone, even if they couldn't answer yet. Eliza kept nursing her shifts, but sometimes she'd find him waiting outside when she got off, holding 2 coffees and that same crooked smile she had first seen behind oxygen tubes and beeping machines. Their connection wasn't dramatic, it didn't need to be. It was built in the pauses, in the long silences that didn't feel empty, in the way he remembered her favorite kind of tea or how she always tapped her thumb against her cup when she was anxious. They weren't healing each other. They were walking beside one another, slowly, honestly, step by step. And neither of them was alone anymore. Autumn crept in softly that year, like someone slipping into a room without wanting to disturb it. The leaves along the riverwalk shifted from green to gold to the color of rusted copper. The air held a different kind of silence, one that made people speak in lower voices, linger in doorways, wear sweaters even when the chill hadn't quite earned it. Samuel had learned to live slower, not out of fragility but intention. Every morning he woke without the mechanical whir of hospital machines. He walked to the cafe by his apartment, the one where the barista already knew to add a bit of cinnamon to his coffee. He read the newspaper in the park even when it rained lightly, just to remind himself he could. He and Eliza never had a conversation about what they were. There wasn't a moment where they declared anything. Instead, there were evenings spent cooking together in her apartment, her voice humming softly to music from the small speaker on the windowsill. There were mornings when he'd leave her a note tucked into the spine of the book she was reading, and afternoons where they didn't speak much at all but still felt entirely together. They found comfort not in what they said, but in how they noticed. He noticed how she always smelled like lavender hand cream and antiseptic from the hospital, how she took her tea without sugar but always added a splash of milk, how she tied her hair up when she was deep in thought, then forgot it was up and did it again. She noticed the way he ran his thumb over his left hand when he was lost in memory, how he still sometimes woke with a startled breath as though surfacing from water, how he kept a notebook by his bed, not for writing dreams, but for anchoring himself. It wasn't perfect. Some days the weight of what had happened still found its way between them. Once, during dinner at a quiet bistro, he saw a former colleague across the room and stiffened. The man didn't recognize him. Samuel didn't wave. He just watched from a distance, feeling like a visitor to a life he no longer belonged to. Later that night, he sat on Eliza's couch, his jaw clenched. "You okay?" she asked, kneeling to untie her boots. "I don't know if I miss it," he said, "or if I just don't know who I am without it." Eliza came to sit beside him. "You're not the same man who walked into that ER a year ago. That's not a failure, that's growth." He nodded but didn't speak. She took his hand. "You don't have to go back to who you were. You're allowed to become someone new." That night he kissed her not out of desire but need. And she let herself be held not out of pity, but because she knew how lonely the spaces between survival and healing could be. They moved in together near the start of winter. Her lease was up and his apartment felt too quiet without her laughter echoing off the walls. They didn't talk about forever, just next steps, just what felt natural. Eliza brought with her a dozen mismatched mugs, a stack of nursing textbooks, and a sleepy gray cat named Iris who liked to perch on windowsills like royalty. Samuel rearranged his bookshelves so their novels could sit side by side. He cleaned out a drawer for her in the bathroom, even though she tried to insist she didn't need it. Their first fight was over something small, laundry of all things. She folded towels a certain way and he didn't. It was the kind of argument that spiraled not because of the thing itself but because of the exhaustion underneath. He was still navigating therapy appointments and she was covering too many shifts. Voices were raised, doors closed harder than they needed to. But later he knocked gently on the door where she'd gone to cool off. He didn't bring an apology wrapped in excuses, just a simple truth. "I don't care how you fold the towels, I just want you here." She opened the door and leaned into his chest. "I just want to be seen." "You are," he said. Winter settled in earnest then. Snow came once or twice, soft and fleeting. Samuel found joy in mundane things, cooking soup while she danced barefoot in the kitchen, watching the cat chase shadows on the wall, reading aloud to her before bed when she was too tired to lift her own book. He no longer felt like he was waiting to return to something. He was already in it. But not all shadows had passed. One evening a letter arrived addressed to his old name, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, Emergency Medicine. The hospital was inviting him back, not full-time, not to the ER, a teaching role, guest lectures, mentorship. He sat with the envelope unopened for hours. When Eliza came home and saw it on the table, she didn't ask. She sat across from him and waited. "I thought I closed that door," he said. "Maybe you just left it ajar," she replied. "I don't know if I can be that man again." "Then don't be this one." He didn't decide right away. He walked to the river. He stared at the ice forming along its edge. He remembered the silence of the coma, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of self. And he remembered the first word that came back to him, her name. When he returned home, Eliza was in the kitchen, warming tea. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I've ever needed you to say." That winter he gave his first lecture in a small auditorium. He stood at the podium with his cane leaning beside him, his notes untouched. He told a room full of wide-eyed students not about the miracle of medicine, but the miracle of human presence. How sometimes what brings a person back isn't a drug or a surgery, but a voice in the dark, a hand that doesn't let go. He didn't say her name, but he didn't need to. Spring came with quiet insistence, pushing up from the cold soil like a secret finally ready to be told. Buds pressed against bare branches, rain softened the city's harsh edges, and the air began to hum again. Life returned not in sudden bursts but in small, deliberate gestures. A robin on the fire escape, a child's laughter echoing off the pavement, a nurse and a man, no longer patients and caregivers, planting herbs on a shared windowsill. Eliza hummed as she worked the soil into the small ceramic pots Samuel had brought home from a weekend market. Basil, mint, and rosemary. She said she liked the way they made a kitchen smell like something lived in. Samuel sat on the floor beside her, sorting seed packets. His hands were steadier now, though he still moved with a slowness that came not from weakness but reverence. He had learned not to rush what was worth holding. "You know," she said, glancing over, "I never thought I'd live with someone again." He raised an eyebrow, terrible roommate in the past. She smiled, "No, just, I like my space, I like my solitude." It felt safe, predictable. He nodded, brushing soil from his fingertips. "I used to fill every moment of my day. Noise, work, people. I thought stillness meant something was wrong. And now I know stillness can mean something is right." Eliza reached for his hand, brushing a thumb over the back of it. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We're not done," he said. "No," she agreed, "but we're somewhere good." That spring brought more than flowers. It brought letters from former patients he didn't remember but who remembered him. Students began seeking him out after lectures, not because he had the best slides or the most dramatic stories, but because he spoke about the work like it was sacred. He never mentioned his own trauma, not directly, but it laced his words quiet and steady. He taught medicine not as conquest over death, but as witness to life. He spoke about compassion like it was a tool, just as vital as any stethoscope. Eliza watched him reclaim parts of himself, not to return to who he had been, but to carry that man forward into something fuller. They took a short trip that May, renting a cabin near a quiet lake. It was her idea. "You need more trees," she'd said one night after a particularly long stretch of lectures and mentoring sessions, "and I need a break from fluorescent lights." The cabin was simple, a wooden porch, 2 chairs, a small kitchen that smelled like cedar. There was no signal, no television, just space and air and time. They hiked in the mornings, slow and steady, stopping to catch their breath when needed. In the afternoons, they read on the porch, legs stretched out, hands sometimes brushing. In the evenings, they cooked together, imperfect meals made perfect by laughter and burnt toast. One night they sat by the lake, wrapped in a blanket, her head on his shoulder. The water mirrored the stars, still and infinite. "Do you ever think about the what-ifs?" he asked. She was quiet a moment, "Sometimes, but not in the way I used to." "How do you mean?" "I used to wonder what I'd be doing if I hadn't found you in that hospital room, if I'd asked to be reassigned, if I hadn't lingered, but now, I think about what if I hadn't let myself care, what if I'd done what we're taught, stayed detached, be professional." "You didn't," he said softly. "I couldn't," she answered. He turned to her, eyes shadowed in the moonlight. "You saved my life." "I held your hand," she said. "You did the rest." They didn't need more words. Some things grow in the space between silence. In early summer, Eliza was offered a teaching position of her own, part-time clinical instruction at the nursing program downtown. She told Samuel with the kind of hesitant pride that belongs to people who have always done their work in the quiet. "I want to say yes," she said, "but I'm scared." He took both her hands. "Do it scared, you've earned this." So they built a life made of ordinary moments. They hosted Sunday dinners for neighbors, took in a second cat, a scrappy black kitten Eliza named Fig. Samuel started writing again, not medical articles but essays, reflections. He didn't call it memoir, he just called it truth. And slowly, without meaning to, they began talking about a future that had no expiration date. One morning years later, Samuel woke early. The room was filled with soft dawn light. Eliza was still asleep, one hand curled near her mouth, the sheet tangled around her legs. He watched her a long while, gratitude settling deep into his chest. He rose, careful not to wake her, and went to the kitchen. The herbs on the windowsill had flourished, basil thick and green, mint fragrant and bold. He made coffee, added a splash of milk to her cup, none to his. When she joined him an hour later, hair tousled, eyes still sleepy, he handed her the cup. "You always do this," she said, smiling. "I always will," he replied. Outside, the city stirred, the world kept moving. And somewhere deep inside them a promise lived, not of perfection, not of never breaking, but of showing up, of holding on, of saying, even in the quietest way, "I'm still here, I'm still choosing you." Every day after the coma was a gift. But the days that followed, the ones where they built a life not out of survival but out of love, they were the miracle.